first time ever.
Hear you loud and clearly.
And it was going place.
That stuff's great.
But the game is not a roguelike.
Boomer shooter.
Bang.
Hello, this is John St. John, and you're listening to KEEP In the Keep, bringing you all the hits from the finest in the world of gaming and entertainment. Now sit back and relax as the drowned god Cthulhu lulls your mind with the tastiest talk in town.
Welcome to another chapter of In the Keep podcast. I'm your very own prophet of the drowned god, the Motherlode. The Keep is a collective of gaming enthusiasts compelled by the drowned god Cthulhu to frag and jib one another into oblivion for all eternity. Welcome! Happy fucking New Year! Hope you guys enjoyed Burning Bridges with Bridge Burner, which was our first little feature of the year. If you haven't already checked it out, it's 5 hours long, and I get pretty tipsy at the end and a little tired because I'm staying up all night. But fell asleep at the end of that one. It was great fun. Just if you're not already a big fan of Bridge Burner, you gotta be on his stream. Bridge Burner number 4. Over on Twitch, and make sure you follow the Hellforge Discord, get all his shit, just everything he does, man. The Age of Hell is going to be one of the most prolific Doom mods ever made, no question about it. Total conversion, as a matter of fact. So, beyond that. But, for now, it is time to get back into In the Keep, the flagship, the Starship Enterprise of podcasts. Maybe I'm tooting my own horn there, but I like what we do here. So this week's guest is Ivar Hill. I couldn't think of anyone better to really kick off the new year with. It's a new year, new time, new game. Core Decay, his project, is... We're going to talk about this a lot. We're going to go in cycles around it in the podcast. But this game is just... There's something special about it. We're on the precipice of where Boomer Shooter, Doom clone, Quake clone, whatever becomes Deus Ex clone, System Shock 2 clone. That's not what Core Decay really is, but we're moving into that era where we repeat the cycle yet again, and you go from the basic first-person shooter to the immersive sim. And Core Decay is looking to be that kind of beautiful project. It has been picked up by 3D Realms because Fred has incredible taste, and so do I, obviously. I hope that you enjoy this wonderful conversation with Ivar. But first, we're going to play a little music by the great and powerful Immorpher. And when it's over, you will be in the keep with Ivar Hill of Core Decay. Today's guest is Mr. Ivar Hill. He is the developer behind the epic game Core Decay, which since Realms Deep has been picked up by 3D Realms, and that is fucking awesome. I'm really fucking happy to hear that, dude. I've been looking at your game for, I think, how long have you been developing it for?
It's been just about, I think, 3.5 years at this point.
So
it's been a while.
At least 2.5 of those 3.5 years, I've been kind of quietly following this project. I'm I don't know if this will ever actually be anything. But you always, from the jump, looked super professional. Like, you know, you're doing this as if you know what you're doing, which a lot of indie devs, I'm looking at them and they're like, yeah, this is never gonna, like, I really believe in the project, but I don't know if it's ever actually gonna get off the ground. But from the jump, like, this dude's got a plan. Like, he's got something going on in here that's special and different. But then, you know, time keeps going, and until I knew, like, okay, he's got funding now, then I was 100% all in. So,
well, I'm really happy that it gives that impression. The secret is, of course, that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. No, but
until you make it right.
yeah, it's also why it's actually been in development for a while. You know, that it's always been that sort of project where I'm letting it take its time, and that, you know, you're not in a rush. And that's really kind of. I feel like that's also like the kind of case with passion projects in general, which is like at the end of the day what Core Decay is and how it started out and how it started being developed. Like if you're unaware, just in general, I guess I can sort of fill you in on sort of the background of its development and how it sort of came to be. So really, it comes down to the fact that I'm a professional game developer in the sense that I work in the industry. I have a full-time job. I'm doing game development, not on Core Decay, but my day job is different. And I'm working there on what is essentially a free-to-play cross-platform MMO, which is the work itself is a lot of fun, and the people in particular that work for are great. You know, so I really enjoy working there. However, like this subject matter, like I've always felt like I really want to do. Like I want to develop something that goes more into that old school single player, like that sort of experience, because that's also what's the most meaningful to me. So that's sort of how Core Decay got started. Like I had a day job and I had my full-time work as like at a game studio as a game developer. And as much as I enjoy that and still enjoy it and continue to do that, I always had that feeling like, okay, but I also have all of these more like passion plans of like, I would really like to make a game like this. So that's sort of how that got started. That being said, and I don't think I've really talked about this before, but it might be interesting to know, Core Decay in general originated as a very different kind of game than what you see today, which might be difficult to believe in the sense that, you know, it's very cohesive at this point in terms of what kind of game it wants to be. But to put it simply, I think that since this was a solo project and it's been a solo development for 2 years or more, 2.5 years, probably even, making something that essentially amounts to a full-scale immersive sim, that's a fairly daunting task. Even, you know, with a team of any size, it's a very large-scale project. So starting out, that was not really my intention, because I felt like that was really past the sort of capabilities of me at the time as a solo dev. Like, despite the fact that I had a fair amount of experience in like most areas of game development, that still, as you say, or you know, as I pointed out, it's like it's a lot of work and it's difficult to make that into like a full solo project like that. So Core Decay actually started out way more akin to like more of a classic retro shooter than an immersive sim. It was far more of an arcade-like experience. My like inspiration sources there were actually mostly like I never actually really grew up with Doom or Quake. I play those games later in life. They were not part of my childhood or my teenage years or my growing up. So they're not actually as influential to me as I think they are to a lot of people in this broader community, right? Because we have so many people here who are like, you know, they're defined by games like, Doom and Quake in particular. And there was always, like, obviously, like today, I've played those games quite a bit, and I've really, like, they have such a huge part in, like, the DNA of not just the shooter genre, but, like, the entire game industry and scene that, like, I really appreciate them for that, but I never had that personal connection to those particular games. What I did play a lot of was, well, first of all, the original Unreal, with its, you know, really like slower paced, more exploration heavy story driven approach. but also Descent, the 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter from '95, which isn't really like a boots on the ground FPS, but it's like Descent and Doom to me. They're very similar in a lot of ways, like at least on a surface level. They have the same kind of space station aesthetic. They have the same kind of overall level flow of like being really focused around open-ended exploration, finding key cards, getting to like different sectors and whatnot. So there's a lot of similarities to me between Doom and Descent. And Descent was really like one of the first games that really defined my growing up. So that's sort of where I started with Core Decay. I felt like, okay, I want to make something of my own in my free time, and I'm going to draw inspiration from basically those two games, Descent and Unreal. And I was sort of imagining it as a boots on the ground Descent in a way. But at that point, there wasn't really a heavy story focus, and there wasn't really like many immersive sim elements. It was far more what you would perhaps describe as classic Doom or Quake style, like a Doom or Quake style shooter, because that is easier to do at least on its surface level, right? Like it still takes a huge amount of design expertise and know-how and all that kind of all of those kind of things to really make it work. Like, you can't just up and make Doom. And like in a way that like it plays well and it's fun. I'm not saying it's any easier in that sense, but it is easier to get the framework in because, there are less overall mechanics. And there are less like, there's less of a patchwork of overlapping things that all have to fit together. There doesn't have to be a huge story component and all those kind of things, right? So I kind of started out the development of Core Decay as a much more arcade-like title with virtually no story elements, really only focusing on like FPS gameplay. And in addition to that, I wanted to also try to release it on mobile devices, which is something that surprises a lot of people. And in particular, people say like, well, why on earth would you ever want to do that? And the reaction people had to that was kind of the reason I wanted to do that in the first place. Because I felt like there was that like really large gap in that market. Like you think of mobile games and nothing stands out as ever evoking that sort of those kind of old school design sensibilities. But in my mind, I felt like there wasn't really any reason that wouldn't be the case. So that was I tried to pave some new ground there. So that was kind of my original design spec for Core Decay. There was way more of a classic retro shooter that was also releasing on mobile, which is extremely different from what you see today. Because really, like I never had any consoles growing up. I was purely I only had PCs, and I was kind of defined by DOS and early PC games in terms of like what I was experienced with. However, what I did have, and this is the most hipster thing I will say all week, I did have a number of PDAs, like Pocket PC, Windows Mobile devices, which almost never, like I never really hear about these days. But, they were essentially like the predecessors of smartphones. Like they weren't really phones, because there weren't really any cellular capabilities, but really just like little handheld computers. For those who might be like unfamiliar, like, I know a lot of people like know what PDAs are, but a lot of people also don't, because they weren't really familiar with that, or they might be younger and like they stopped being a thing altogether. But I had a bunch of those, and there was actually a games scene for PDAs, which is weird when you think about it, because they were mainly manufactured as like business devices. But there were a lot of really good games for like these tiny little handheld devices. They were really, in all regards, basically phones. There was literally even like a full Age of Empires 1 port, and it worked fantastically. So that was sort of where I started realizing that, okay, you can probably make more of an in-depth old school game on today's mobile devices and actually have it be good. And the only reason that it doesn't really exist is that there are these preconceptions about what mobile games are supposed to be and whatnot. So I had that sort of feeling of, okay, I should try to do that, and it'll probably be pretty decent. And that's still kind of a hard thing to visualize and conceptualize. And I think where I really felt like, okay, this could probably work is when I realized that if you look at the original Doom and its control scheme, that actually corresponds pretty well to like a touch joystick, like a virtual joystick, because there is no vertical aim. So you could actually move and look at the same time, which is, usually like controls is the reason that you don't see a lot of those kind of games on those kind of platforms. So that worked fairly early on, and so I felt, okay, I can actually make this like a mobile classic FPS that people might actually realize that, oh, this is actually, I didn't know I wanted this, but it actually kind of works. And again, this is kind of weird because this is so different from what Core Decay is trying to be today. And I think it's hard to pinpoint exactly where that changed. But I feel like over time, as development progressed and as it actually kind of got to a good place, and I never really felt like there was any massive roadblocks, and things didn't take quite as long as I thought they would, I was sort of gradually realizing that, well, one, I'm not really in a hurry, and two, I can actually make a game that is more that is closer to like what my vision of like my dream game would kind of be than I thought I could. For those who don't know, in other words, those who haven't heard me talk about it basically every day, the original Deus Ex is by far my favorite game of all time. It's really like as a game developer, I it's not too uncommon that you have people ask like, oh, what's your favorite game? And you would think that it would be like, oh, well, it's really hard to say. There are so many. It kind of depends. No, the original Deus Ex, hands down. And that's been the case. Like, I think I've played that game for more hours than any other game I've ever played. I make a point of trying to play Deus Ex 1 like at least once a year since it came out. So I have a really strong connection to the original Deus Ex. And there are so many things that I really love about it, and I could turn this entire talk into just like a design, like introspection of Deus Ex. But that's kind of like, if I look at what I've actually wanted to make, like I've always wanted to make something that's sort of a celebration of those design sensibilities and the experience that the original Deus Ex evokes, and that's sort of where like. For each year I was working on Core Decay, I was sort of realizing that I can actually make that into that. Like, it actually started to be something that, like, I thought that I was way more limited by scope, but it sort of started to feel like, given some more time, I can actually turn this, I can take this and move it away from that sort of more like arcadey experience to something that more resembles an immersive sim. And obviously, it was when 3D Realms got involved that it was like the largest affirmation of that. That's okay. That can really happen, and you can really take it into that full, like you can make it into a full immersive sim, and not just like some weaker elements of that. Which is also when, well, it was actually some time before that, but along with that, I also ended up deciding to essentially cut the entire. At least in any kind of comprehensible future, the entire aspect of releasing it on mobile devices, because that was sort of my. There was something that I wanted to do because it hadn't been done, but as it got closer to something that resembled like more of my like artistic creative vision, there wasn't really a need for that anymore. And once it was clear that I could make this game into more of a fully fledged immersive sim, that was way more of a design obstacle than anything. So for anyone who might like with a slight sense of worry feel like, oh, will this be impacted by like mobile design considerations? No, the game is not planned to release on mobile. That's no longer an aspect of the game. Maybe one day in the future, sure, but not for the original, like for the initial development cycle at least, because at this point, what the game is trying to be is very different. So in a sense, the entire sort of history of the development of Core Decay, it's sort of what you see a lot in indie development in reverse. Because I know that, you often see things like indie devs, especially indie devs who might not have like studio experience or professional experience. They go way up in scope and they say, oh, I'm going to make an MMO, or, oh, I'm going to make an open world huge RPG or something. But then obviously you find out that, well, okay, that's kind of impossible, especially if you're only one person or if you only have a limited amount of resources. So you have to step way down and make something like that's a lot more sort of down to earth. Core Decay was kind of the opposite. I started out thinking that, okay, I'm going to make something really, really small, like very self-contained, just to get something out there. And then from there, it kind of grew into, oh, maybe I can actually make something that more closely resembles my dream game, or the kind of dream game that I really want to make, that really speaks to me artistically, and that's a lot larger in scope. So I guess you can say it's feature creep the game, but I'm happy to say that the scope at this point is actually very, very strongly defined and sort of locked down, which is nice, because that's otherwise a common challenge and obstacle, I feel, when it comes to game development. You just keep having these things creeping in of like, oh, we should add this and we should add that, but at this point, and I guess I kind of want to touch upon that actually a little bit in terms of what Core Decay is trying to be, because it was actually a shock for me as well when the first kind of publicity that Core Decay got was when PC Gamer picked it up and they did an article on it, which to me, I mean, even though I've been a game developer like actually in the industry for a while, that still was kind of surreal, because then we had like the game, and at that point it was I'm trying to recall the time frame. I think there was one more guy at the project at that point, which was Surge. But I think, if I recall the time frame correctly, but for the most part, it had been a solo project, and suddenly PC Gamer was writing about it, and there was still there was a certain surreal feel to that in a sense, because there was still like my personal creation. They were starting writing about it. Like, wow. But anyway, so that was cool. However, the PC Gamer article, their interpretation, like they essentially described the game as the spiritual successor to Deus Ex. Mm-hmm. And I was reading that and I was like, oh, it's like, I would love to do that, but I don't know if that's exactly what it is. Because that's like a really tall order. Like that's almost like you can't. Like I have always envisioned this game as something that is far, far smaller in scope. And that's like, it's nice that they interpret it like that, and that's something, because I mean, yeah, sure, on like a more abstract level, that's what it's trying to be. But if people go in, like once Core Decay comes out and people pick it up and they start playing it, if they expect it to be like literally a spiritual successor to Deus Ex, they might be a little bit disappointed, because it's not trying to literally be Deus Ex, right? It still has more. I think more than one person has sort of described it as Quake meets Deus Ex, which is, I think, a little bit more, which is, I guess, essentially System Shock. But it's interesting, like, for instance, like the game will not really have things like city hubs, right? With tons of people you can walk around and interact with and have like long branching dialogues with, like those kind of things, or like really large scale cinematic cutscenes and those kind of things. Like they are not really within the scope of the game, right? It's still a scaled down, more sort of a smaller scale idea of what an immersive sim can be. So that PC Gamer article was both a boon and a sort of the start of expectations that might be way too high as well. Because again, there's like, people get really, really excited when they hear this game is attempting to be the next Deus Ex, right? Like that's, and they conjure all these images in their head of like, oh, like this is going to be, something that's absolutely amazing. And of course you want it to be something that's absolutely amazing. But at the same time, you go in with a lot of preconceived expectations. Once you start comparing it to like the real classics and the real like legendary games, you got to be careful with that, right? Because it's still trying to be its own thing.
No, in regards to that comparison, like I never really, I did read that article, but I never envisioned this game being like Deus Ex in that way. And it really comes down to, I knew you were at the time at least, I knew you were a solo developer, and I'm like, that's
Right.
not achievable. I mean,
Exactly.
that's
Exactly.
not
Impossible.
I always
No,
pictured
I
it
mean-
more like Shock 2, you know, like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something
Exactly.
A little cleaner, a little simpler, but in my opinion,
Yep.
I love System Shock 2. I think it's one of the greatest games ever made. But it's, you know, it stays in its wheelhouse. It doesn't try to do anything
Right.
completely crazily fancy, because when you start doing that kind of shit, especially as a small team or whatever with Deus Ex style gameplay where you have all these cutscenes and just there's too many things that can go wrong, and you're rolling
Right.
into Slav jank territory very quickly.
No, exactly. It's really, yeah, it's literally impossible. Like, you know, you can't make a game that follows that particular template as a solo project unless you have 20 years of time, and, you know, and I mean, even Deus Ex itself was absolutely fraught with development obstacles, right? Like my favorite anecdote from the development of the original Deus Ex was when they had two teams. Like, they had decided to separate the development studio into two teams, kind of both working towards the same thing, because they felt like they would cause some, like, a sense of healthy competition, I believe. Like, that was sort of the idea. However, they had to call these two internal teams Team 1 and Team A, because neither team would really be happy with being Team 2, which is hilarious to me. But it's just like one of those like things that are indicative of like even the actual Deus Ex was like had a lot of obstacles in its development, and if you're just a single person trying to make something similar, yeah, it's not achievable.
Yeah. And at the time, that was like a big company with a lot of funding and a lot of hands on deck.
Yeah, exactly.
We all know what happened ultimately. Ion.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think it was just like too many chefs, right? I mean, that was just like everyone on that studio was like a lead something from somewhere else, and it just yeah. But anyway, yeah, System Shock is actually, in terms of the actual gameplay, System Shock and System Shock 2 in particular is a much closer comparison. I think the reason that Deus Ex is a more commonly brought up comparison, and the reason that I personally am also more inclined to bring up Deus Ex more commonly as a comparison, is that like the actual themes of the game and the tone of the game is more akin to Deus Ex. Like, if you look at the game's storyline, and like the various things that the game explores, narratively speaking, it's very evocative of Deus Ex. In terms of the setting, it's also very evocative. Like, you have that near future, sort of slightly cyberpunk-esque or slightly dystopian, slightly sort of conspiracy-ridden, like that overall setting is very much also what Core Decay is doing. So I think that's also where a lot more of the Deus Ex comparisons come from, because you look at System Shock, it's more like high sci-fi. I know it's still trying to be more grounded, but I mean, you're literally on a space station. Like, you can only get so grounded.
It's kind of the same thing with, like, you know, Star Trek, right? Like, even though it is this extremely extravagant story that's being told, it really is just the camera is them on a ship, and it settles it down. Are you familiar with the SMART method? Or this, it's a model. It's like a thought model. So it's for setting goals.
I'm not positive. Sorry, it's for what?
It's for setting goals, right? So
okay.
I talk to, you know, lots of very creative people all the time, and you strike me as like one of these people that you have all these amazing ideas, and it's just bursting out of you so quickly that you're like like overwhelmed by it. And it's important to have that kind of person. But you're working with Scarecrow now on this game.
Yep.
Okay. So he's like the perfect counterpart, you know, because he's just a brainiac kind of person. But so the SMART model is just a way of setting your goals. So it's that they should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And that keeps everything in perspective. So when you start a game, you know, 2.5 years later, your idea of what that game is totally different. So now you've already derailed from the plan. But if you have set this in motion ahead of time, like it needs to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based, and you don't deviate from that plan, you will then more likely accomplish the goal, right?
Right. Yeah. I really feel like, I mean, in any kind of project, but the game development in particular, it's such a an easy pitfall, right? And not just feature creep, but just in general having a sense of the overall direction too. As you say, like you start out, and again, like Core Decay is emblematic of that, because it started out as one thing and it gradually changed into something that's very different. And I have really, like, it's been very, very important for me that, like, at every step along that way, to step back and to try to think, like, okay, where are we actually going? Making sure it's not spinning out of control or anything like that. And I am happy to say that at this point, obviously not going into, like, fine details of, like, the actual development process here, because that's not particularly interesting. But I am happy to say that the entirety of the game, which includes, mechanics, content, this storyline, whatnot, is entirely scoped out, right? Which sounds obvious, but like the amount of indie projects that I have ran into, when there are people who make a game and you ask, okay, so what's the final game going to look like? And they're like, we'll see when we get there. Yeah. So it's been really important for me to always have that sense of, like, making sure that things are, as you say, like, to have everything, like everything you do be. I'm trying to recall your acronym. Well, I know it's not your acronym. No. But to have things obtainable and measurable, it's so important. I agree 100%. Which is also why, like, if you look at the, there is a video. It hasn't been super heavily promoted. Like, it's not like the trailer, which was spread all over social media that we did before Realms Deep. Mm-hmm. But there is, like, a 5-minute gameplay video on YouTube of the game that's literally just, like, exploring a level for a few minutes with no commentary. And you can actually note a lot of those prioritizations if you look at that gameplay video, in terms of, like, see if I can think of a good example. Like, the way that the entire game is structured, it's with a very, very small scope in mind, right? Like, within that entire piece of gameplay footage, the things that you do and the way that, like, the narrative unfolds, it all fits into sort of the same template as a means to keep the scope down, right? Like, and that's also what's really nice. I actually realized as I was starting to look at, again, I started to look at games like Deus Ex, and I started to think, okay, I have kind of decided for myself that I want to develop a game that is not as some would put it, a spiritual successor, but a game that's inspired by everything that I love about Deus Ex, right? Yeah. And you start to think, okay, so what aspects of that particular game, like you don't want to just say, Deus Ex did this, so I'm going to do this, right? You want to say, okay, these are things that games like Deus Ex did. Why did they do them, and what were they trying to achieve? Am I trying to achieve the same things? And might that then also be a good way of doing it, right? Like, that's the way you have to think. And an example of that is putting a lot of narrative in computer terminals and log entries and things like that, right? Like, because that's something that's a staple of a lot of immersive sims, but Deus Ex in particular. And again, it would be easy to say, oh, like, a game like Core Decay has a lot of computer terminals because a game like Deus Ex had a lot of computer terminals, but that's not really getting to the why, right? And I quickly understood and kind of found that by moving a lot of the actual world building and narrative and like storytelling to, like, that loop of exploring the game levels and finding left behind logs and emails and computers and those kind of, like, subjective first person like little tidbits of narrative, that also allows you to have this really rich and complex world that you present in a lot of detail, like, in a really small scope, right? You don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars on voice actors. You don't have to do hundreds of cutscenes and motion cap this and animated that and tons of unique art assets for, all of these different, like, you can fit a ton of storytelling into the game solely in that one mechanic, right? Which is a good example of, like, how this game is also designed with that in mind. Like, a lot of these things you see, they're not just there because it was done in earlier classic immersive sims. but it's more like they did it, and they did it for a specific reason, and that reason is also a part of what's trying to be achieved here. So, and that might seem like a subtle distinction, but I think it's a really important one.
I mean, in terms of all the crazy shit you can do with a game, when you start throwing in cutscenes and voice actors and everything that goes into it, let's like actually take a moment and go back and look at Duke Nukem 3D. Deus Ex is another good example. Like, doesn't matter how great your voice, you could literally have the best voice actor of all time, which Duke 3D arguably did. We don't enjoy those cutscenes because they're good. We enjoy them because they're hilariously bad, right? And
I mean, yeah, I love Deus Ex 1 to bits. Really, like, I've spent literally thousands of hours in that game. The voice acting in many areas is horrendous. Yeah.
And the scenes are all janky and shit breaks. And I mean, like, it doesn't matter how much funding you have. It's a nearly, I'm not going to say completely, because I mean, there are examples like maybe Uncharted. It's nearly impossible to have a game function at that scale without any bullshit happening that's just like makes it like either broken or hilariously bad.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I guess what the main thing I would bring up would be Witcher 3, which, like, one of the big reasons that it saw such acclaim was that it was so huge in scope and production values that still managed to feel completely true to it, like its full vision, right? So that would be like the one example that I can think of.
It launched like shit.
That really did achieve that.
It ate my CPU
That's true.
alive. And,
yeah. No, of course, it was obviously not perfect, but if you look at the state of the game today, it's like, yeah, that's a pretty good example of like all the pieces truly coming together in a way that's really admirable.
Witcher 3, after it had been worked on for another 2 years since its release, is easily one of my like top five games of all time. Like, I love the whole Witcher series, top to bottom. But
absolutely, yeah,
we can't ignore the fact that like it totally launched like crap. Like, people are all like, Cyberpunk, oh god. Like, I'm like, yeah, but like
I know.
3 was the same way when it came out. Like, it's you don't buy a game when it first comes out anymore. It's just not a AAA game anyway.
Yeah, it's and part of that, honestly, like, in my mind, part of it also has to do with market expectations in a way that like this, like every year and like every generation, as new games come out, we kind of just expect them to be to have like 10 times the fidelity of the previous games, yet cost the same amount of money and be developed by the same amount of people and be like 100 times greater in scope. Something's gotta give, right? And I'm not saying that like, consumers are to blame for the state of games, game releases. Of course not. But it's a more nuanced picture than just, developers are lazy or greedy and they're just going to throw them out. Like, it's not that simple, right? I mean, in most cases,
to be made it's capitalism's fault. It's John Locke's fault. But I mean, obviously, everybody, you got to feed yourself and everything. But yeah, as you said, they expect to spend the same amount of money, the same amount of people, but have a better product every single year. And it's just, this is why I prefer talking to folks that are working on projects that are literally like their passion projects, because it's not, maybe you're doing it for some money, but you already have a job, right? Like, you didn't set up to do Core Decay because you wanted to make $1 million, right?
Right. No, exactly. I mean, if anything, back when mobile was still a consideration, like an active goal of the project, that was also a conversation that I had with a number of industry veterans that I know through my work. These are people who have worked in the game industry for 40 years. Real, they know what they're doing, right? But they were telling me also, and I was talking to them. I was talking about monetization models, right? And I was like, well, so I'm making this game and I'm planning to have a mobile version and I want to sell it for $10, right? Mm-hmm. Because, that's the only viable way to have a game like this to me, in a way that that makes the actual concrete experience for the player what I want it to be, and the response from all of these people were, well, no, you're not going to make any money because no one's going to spend $10 on a game on the mobile platform, because that's just not the market expectations, right? But that was, again, where, I was like, okay, I'm fine with that. Like, okay, maybe it's not going to make any money, but that's all right. Because again, it's a passion, like at that time in particular, it was a passion project. It was like making money off it was not the point. Now, of course, at this point, that's different, because as soon as you loop in an actual studio with people who are, working on this to make a living, well, of course you needed to make money, because I mean, that's just common sense, once we have, now there are, now that 3D Realms and Slipgate are on board, now we're talking about, like, I'm not the only one working on this game. There are people working on this game who need to make a living. So the game obviously needs to do financially, like, reasonably well to have that be viable. So of course that's different, but it's always a balance. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but what really gets to me most of the time is when people complain about, like, when they really always default back to the concept of greed. They're like, these developers are greedy. They do this because they're greedy. And yeah, that does happen, but honestly, 9 times out of 10, at least to my, like, as far as I can see it, really, you're just trying to make ends meet. Like, it comes down to that, even for if you go in, like, an extreme and you look at, like, free-to-play games, right? With these, like, terrible monetization models that are legitimately, like, terrible in the sense that they interfere with the enjoyment of the rest of the gameplay mechanics, right? But you're looking at that and you think, okay, so the devs put in all of these ways that you can spend money in the game because they're greedy. I'm not saying it's not detrimental, but I don't think greed has anything to do with it for the most part. What you're looking at is like, oh, I'm running a studio of 20 people. They're all trying to put food on the table. They need to get paid somehow, and this is the lowest risk way for that to happen, right? And that doesn't mean it's not a good thing, but it's a problem that's arisen through like these feedback loops of market interaction, right? Like we have people now who are fully on board with spending thousands of dollars in microtransactions, in a way that, like, leads to game design that's just not very enjoyable anymore. But the problem there isn't that the devs are greedy and want thousands of dollars. The problem is that, you're trying to keep a studio afloat. And when you look at, like, what's the safest way I can do this, that's the least likely for me to have to let go of, 10 people. Yeah, that's going to be through certain monetization models that's proven to be less risky. And it sucks that it is that way. But it doesn't come down to greed for the most part. And that's something that I see time and time again.
To be made between, I don't think artists, who I would consider most of your developers like artists, whether that be, a coder, an actual programmer can be an artist in a way, or a literal artist, or a voice actor, or a, whatever it happens to be. Map designers, most artists are never acting out of greed, right? Like, they're acting out of, they need to create.
Right.
That's their greed, is that I want to create something. It's when you need money to accomplish that goal, and then the person who's investing in that goal,
right,
can be a really good person, that's who wants to take care of everybody on the team and all that.
Right.
Or it could be a big group of people who could give a shit about your game but just want to make money, and they see it as an investment. So then they will start compromising what you want to do to help them get what they want out of it. And that's when it becomes a problem, right? So you kept saying the word developers, like, I don't think of any developer that I've never met a greedy developer, to be honest with you. But I've met a lot of greedy car salesmen.
I guess what I'm sort of trying to get to is, like, even if you look at, like, publishers, like, obviously, like, yes, there is legitimate greed in the industry. Of course there is. But even when you look at people who aren't like personal developing the game, I still feel like it's often a case of, like, just wanting to not have to shut down your studio, right? And I think, like, at the end of the day, my point is that things are just a little bit more nuanced than they're often made out to be. Of
course, yeah. Nothing's black and white except for me on camera. That's it.
Now, all that being said, I should probably just make sure to say this straight out. Like, even though I just spent the last 10 minutes saying, well, things like microtransactions in games, they might be detrimental to game design, but I can understand why they choose to be put in and whatnot. Core Decay, nothing like that. There are not going to be any kind of monetization models put into Core Decay that's not you pay money for the game, you get the game, period. Just to make sure that that's obvious.
I would way rather just pay you a bunch of money. I'd rather pay you like regularly, like every time. You just keep the content coming and make it good. Well, and give you that one time, like, here's the money, and I want to support you. Than I would ever want to like have to buy a feature of the game. You know what I mean? Right.
And like, you have to understand here that like I literally work on free to play monetization for a living. Like, well, I mean, not solely. I mean, I do a lot of things, but I have, at this point, a number of years of experience, and so I've seen. Like, I do have like a personal perspective of exactly all the reasons that this can be terrible, because it usually is pretty terrible. So that's a big reason why Core Decay exists. Like, nothing ill said of like the work that I do at like my day job, because again, this is an MMO, so it's a live service game, so you kind of have to have that, otherwise it just wouldn't be viable. And it's a lot of fun to work on this, and again, the people I work with are great, and I really, really enjoy it. But I kind of feel like, in addition to that, like I also want to pour some of my creative energy into something that, that isn't that. And yeah, like when it comes down to things like microtransactions, it's just one of those things where I feel like people are upset about them often for the wrong reasons. Like the core issue with all of that, it isn't things like pay to win, even though that's kind of a problem. The issue is that, like, designing a game around active monetization like that is directly counterproductive to designing gameplay mechanics that are immersive and interesting. It's not about spending money to be better. It's about putting these things in the game that makes for a less immersive and less self-contained experience. Right. And there is always going to be people who say like, oh, I hate this free-to-play game because it has all of these paywalls. And I say, no, there should be more paywalls. Like, that's a much better way of doing things. Like, pay a sum of money to access an entire chunk of the game. That's fine. Pay a tiny bit of money to just become a little better at something, or that's what leads to,
or even cosmetics, right? Like that. Even that breaks it.
I really, I hate. Man, it bothers me so much. Like we have this dichotomy now of cosmetic and non-cosmetic, and people say, oh, I'm fine with in-game purchases if it's just cosmetics. And like, to me, it's like,
on your goal, right?
Okay.
It depends on the type of game.
Yeah. Of course it does. Look at like Overwatch. Totally fine. Nothing wrong with it.
Player game, all people care about is whether or not it breaks their ability to compete. So if you can buy a better weapon than the other guy, or an ability the other guy doesn't have, that's bullshit. But if it's cosmetic, I can like, that doesn't bother me. The same thing with Quake Champions. Like, as much as I don't care about cosmetics, I'm fine with the developers making their money as long as it doesn't break my ability.
Absolutely reasonable.
Yeah.
But you look at something like an RPG, and you look at something like, okay, now you can spend real money to get like a really cool looking piece of armor, right? The problem is that in an RPG, like, your character progression and the way your character looks, they're kind of innately tied together. Like you break the immersion of the game world. The way I usually look at it is essentially this. If a game has any kind of store that offers you to pay real money to get something, right? Okay. Now imagine that instead of that being a store with real money, it was literally just a button you press and you get all of that for free, right? Like, you literally just click a button and everything that's in any kind of in-game store, it's just given to you right away. You just get it, period. Would the game now be boring or not fun? If the answer is yes, then it's a problem, right? Because again, you look at something like an RPG, and you look at something like, oh, you're selling all these cosmetic items, and you're selling all of these, like, maybe you're even selling things like health potions or something, if it's like, for real money. Okay, so if you got all of that for free, now the game would not be even remotely interesting, because A, it wouldn't be challenging, and B, you have all of these, like the way that your character looks and presents itself is no longer tied to accomplishments you have made within the game. It just makes everything meaningless. So that's the greater issue. The greater issue is that all of these monetization models they lead to a loss of immersion. And again, they create this dichotomy in terms of the cosmetic stuff, like where the way you look and the way you behave is completely disconnected. And yes, that works well in some games, but in other games, it completely breaks things. Like you don't necessarily want that because it just robs you of all the immersion of getting there. Which is, again, why I like that the industry has moved a little bit more towards things like the Battle Pass, Season Pass kind of systems. They're still not great, but they're a lot better because the idea is, you spend some money, but in order for it to actually mean anything, you still have to play the game. It's still not great, but it's a lot better than what we have seen in the past of just, give me $20 and you're going to get all of this stuff to make the game is maybe easier and therefore not as engaging. It's not.
Yeah, I can see why like a live online game, right, that you play all the time, that the developers will never actually be done developing until it's gone, if they decide to shut it down. It's the problem. It's sort of like a what is it called? The snake that circles the world.
Right.
It bites his own tail because you're essentially in this position where you've started a game that you will never be done developing, and you're going to have to constantly keep updating it and keep engaging people over and over and over again, as opposed to a single player game where you can still replay it, I guess, but it's just like, here's a self-contained experience. So when you're in a situation,
self-contained experience,
yeah,
that's the way to put it.
So when you're in a situation where you're making a game, I'm just going to use Quake Champions because it's one of my faves, but I can understand why the season pass thing works for them, because it allows people to continue to fund them as they continue to go. If you just said, okay, here's $60 and I'm never going to give you money again, they're inevitably going to run out of money at some point. So it's interesting. Game, you just have to make your budget, right?
Exactly. Like that's why I want so much to make this like single player, completely self-contained. Mm-hmm. You buy it once, that's the game. I'm not saying it's never going to be updated. No, that's an entirely different rabbit hole right there. I've seen Steam reviews of like single player games that are like, finished games. They work great. And they're like, thumbs down, great game, but it's a shame the developer abandoned it. What does that even mean? This is like, it's become the mentality now that like, how old am I?
Yeah.
I'm going to be 28 this month.
So we're like right in the same, I'm 25. So we're in the same kind of development cycle of how our brains work. But, kids that are 16, 17, like they have a totally different expectation. Right. I'm not saying all of them. There's plenty of really smart kids out there, but they've been conditioned to this idea that like my game never ends, and I'm like, no, it's okay.
I know. And
it's okay to pay money to go see the movie, right? Like, and then you see the movie and then it's over, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's true that if you look at live service games, you look at like MMOs, you look at a lot of multiplayer shooters, by definition, they kind of want to go on for as long as possible because you need other players to play them, right? And even though you could release like Quake 3 Arena back in the day, and it, or Unreal Tournament, or the original Counter-Strike, whatnot, and they stayed, they had huge player bases for a very long time, you would think that would still be the case. The problem is that the market is so saturated, right? Like new games come out all the time.
There's other problems too. Like if you can't set up your, because what kept Quake and Doom alive for all these years was like
dedicated
players could just have their own dedicated servers and pop them up anytime. The development was not on the developers anymore. Like they're just like, okay, do whatever you want.
No, of course.
And then
yeah, exactly. I never played a ton of Quake, like multiplayer in any of sort of multiplayer incarnations. I did play a bunch of Unreal Tournament. I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion, but I actually really liked 2004. That was kind of that's one of my favorites.
It's not uncommon.
It's not like mechanically, I don't think it's as good as the original 99, but the sheer amount of variety that it offered really, like, I found that really appealing because there was just so much you could do, so many game modes, so many maps, and I remember, like, I haven't played it now in years, to be honest, but I would spend so much time literally just like, I think my like my folder on my hard drive for like Unreal Tournament, it was like 50 gigabytes or something like that because of the mods and content and maps and whatnot. You could, as you say, like the community just kind of creates its own content over and over and over. And I kind of feel like when you look at live service games, so MMOs aside, because MMOs are kind of inherently just different. But if you look at something like, I don't know, say Call of Duty or Battlefield 5 or, whatnot, I feel it's really just like large developers that are trying to adapt to this idea of like, okay, we're not going to keep players engaged for that long because they're just going to be like, there's so much saturation, they're going to play other things. So we're going to try to make the game have new things over and over and over for as long as possible to make as much money as possible. And again, it doesn't necessarily come out of greed. It comes out of, okay, because then we're going to invest that money into the next, the next project. I'm not saying Activision and whatnot aren't necessarily greedy. That I'm not going to comment on that. But but the point being that I these people aren't stupid, right? They're don't quote me on that. But they're like everything, right, that you see about AAA games and these kinds of, it's all calculated risk, right? Like that's honestly like what it comes down to at the end of the day. Like these games are designed the way they do because it's considered financially the what has the highest probability to yield a profit in the sense that these companies can continue to exist and continue to make games.
It's very simple, man. Like I think you're nuking. You're going way too far with it. It's like, is your goal to make a really good game and charge people a fair price, or is your goal to make a game that makes you a lot of money? And that you can make a lot of money the ethical way, but if you go the other route, it doesn't necessarily result in a really good immersive game.
Right, and that's why it's so amazing that we have all of these indie games and smaller developers, and at the same time, I don't want to get too far in that other direction, but once you reach, at least this is all my personal opinion. Obviously you can't take that for fact, but I feel that once you reach a certain like level of production values, that becomes less of like a viable thing to say, just because there is just too much money involved. That simply saying, we're going to make a good game and that's all we're going to care about. Once you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, that becomes a lot harder to look at in a vacuum like that, because if you do fail, that's a lot of money, right? And again, I'm not defending huge publishers, but I'm trying to like reason around like how it's being thought of. And honestly, it's kind of apples and oranges, because you have amazing indie games, you have thousands and thousands of amazing indie games. But then you also have like some of these AAA games, they're enjoyable specifically because they have these high production values. Like that's its own interesting thing. It's not the same. Like you can't compare it directly, right? But even look at something like Call of Duty campaigns, right? Say what you want about Call of Duty campaigns, but they can be enjoyable the same way, say, a Michael Bay Hollywood is enjoyable, right? And yeah, that can be fun. And you can't do that necessarily without those huge budgets, because that's just part of what makes it what it is. So yeah, there really are kind of apples and oranges. They're just trying different things, and I honestly think both should exist. Even though obviously the industry needs to take a step back and evaluate, working conditions. They need to evaluate the value proposition to the products they put out to like the consumers and whatnot. Anyway, way off on a tangent here.
Let's put it this way: like if you're working for 3D Realms, right? Your boss, who I know, deeply cares about making great games, and making money is like part of it, but it's not his entire fucking goal. His goal, I know Fred is passionate about making fantastic games. If you worked for Activision, who fucking knows? Who has any idea?
No, of course.
So
I don't want to just to for clarification. I'm not really defending the policies of large publishers. It's more about I'm trying to reason around why they're acting the way they are. Then, whether that should be the case or not, yeah, probably not. And yeah, of course, you want the system to always promote that sort of emphasis on creativity and passion, obviously. But I do think it's doing the conversation a disservice by simply defaulting to, Activision are greedy, and then not really delving into how things are actually working.
The only thing is I don't know who Activision is, right? Like I'm sure there's a guy who's the CEO, but then there's like millions of dollars from several different investors, all poking. It's entropy, right? It's this system that's become so complex that it can't be managed. It's chaos, essentially. Controlled chaos, maybe, but it's not a smart plan. It's not a specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-based plan.
Well, yeah, no. And it's funny, all of this kind of stems from me emphasizing that Core Decay will not have any microtransactions.
It's okay, man. It's a conversation. Like, this is an opportunity for people to get to know you and how you think, right?
Right. Make a lot of enemies along the way.
Yeah. And if they like you, they'll buy your game, and if they don't like you, then they just won't, I guess. The goal here is to make you
which is fine, That's for sure. But yeah, back to going back to Core Decay, it definitely is 100% a passion project, regardless of anything else. It really just comes down to sort of going back to the qualities that made these early immersive sims so enjoyable, and all of these things that just like another thing that I often come back to as an example of like Core Decay kind of stands out from 3D Realms' roster of games in a lot of ways. I know that with Graven, that's sort of Graven to my I'm not intimately familiar with Graven, right? Like, I'm not part of the development of Graven, so I can't speak for it, in any kind of great depth. But to me, Graven is sort of the in-between there. It's sort of the bridge between like a full-blown immersive sim, which isn't really, it feels, I shouldn't say it like that, because who defines immersive sim, really? But it's still like, it has a lot of like retro FPS DNA in it as well, right? Again, I'm talking as just as much of an outsider as anyone else on Graven. Like, I don't have any kind of internal knowledge of that much. But Core Decay, meanwhile, is really like what I would consider to be more of a full-blown immersive sim, which is also like a term that's been discussed, back and forth a lot. But the best way to illustrate that to me is the role of combat. You look at Doom or Quake, you look at, basically any classic shooter. Mm-hmm. Combat is sort of its own reward, in a sense. Like, that is, it's not the means to an end, it's its own end, right?
Like, it's to kill the enemies and get the key and exit the room.
Yeah. The point of combat in games like, Doom, Quake, it's really, it's kind of twofold. One is the actual sort of adrenaline rush and sort of the emotional appeal of it, the audio-visual, sort of almost like the player being an extension of like you, like all of that kind of stuff, like the visceral feeling of being in the midst of combat as its own enjoyable experience, right? Like, that's part of it, and the rest of it is sort of the strategic, tactical appeal of like being good at it, right? Like, and vast simplification, obviously, of the appeal of combat in an FPS, but the point is that the game is really about the combat, and it's refined that to like perfection, and simply engaging in combat is what you want to do because it's really enjoyable. Compare that to the role of combat in more of a full-blown immersive sim such as Deus Ex or indeed Core Decay. Combat is really, it's not really there for its own sake. It's really just one mechanic among many to facilitate meaningful decisions. Like, as you play a game like this, it's not obvious to engage in combat, right? It's really more about these enemies here present an obstacle. I can engage in combat with them. That's one thing I can do, and that's at the cost of, well, one, risk of death, complete lost state, spending ammo, which might be in really limited quantities, or just losing health in general, which is a valuable resource, alerting more enemies escalates, so you have to balance that, and you can say, okay, so maybe I want to find a different way around this entirely, or right. Maybe I want to solve this, maybe I want to sneak past these enemies, maybe I want to do this and that, right? And so the role of combat isn't really at all the same as the role of combat in a pure FPS.
Right.
It's really just about...
Gloomwood is also kind of
the point...
That perspective, like a more like a survival horror way of doing it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And the point isn't necessarily that you can play through the entire game without ever engaging in combat. Even Deus Ex did not let you do that. With a couple very notable exceptions to like that presumption. But the point is rather that even though you're expected to engage in combat quite a bit in general, when you do so, it's at your own volition, and it's really up to you how you want to approach it. And if you want to play the game, like Core Decay in particular, it's really designed around that sort of the mentality of choosing the way you want to play the game, which is really sort of a pillar of any immersive sim. If you want to play the game as a shooter, you can play the game as a shooter, right? Like, you can upgrade yourself in ways that makes you more proficient at combat. Mm-hmm. You can get rid of those like sort of early handicaps that makes combat more challenging and like less of an obvious choice. Yeah, you can work around that. You can say, I'm gonna give myself more health. I'm gonna give myself the ability to, shoot while sprinting. I'm going to become more accurate in this and that, right? I'm going to take my limited inventory space and I'm going to dedicate it entirely to tons of guns and tons of ammo, right? You can do that. And then you play the game as a shooter, and you can play the game through as a shooter, and that's it. That's a perfectly viable approach. And if you want to do that, you can absolutely do that. If alternatively you want to say, well, I only really want to engage in combat when absolutely necessary, you can instead say, okay, I'm going to be a lot better at exploration. I'm going to like upgrade myself in ways that benefits finding different areas of each level, bypassing combat encounters entirely. I'm going to stash my inventory full of lockpicks and, medkits in various like tools that make me proceed in like non-combat ways. That's also a completely viable approach, right? And most people will be sort of in between. But that like the role of combat as more of a one tool among many is really what like defines, I think, the design philosophy of Core Decay as opposed to a lot of retro shooters in general. And obviously, it's not a matter of which approach is best. There is no such thing. They serve different purposes because they're different games. But yeah, it's different. It's definitely it's I think it stands out in that roster, and it also hasn't really been. I mean, now we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of these kind of games that are either like what you would consider full out immersive sims, or what you would consider sort of immersive sim-esque, or with inspirations from those kind of games. They're coming back a little bit, but it's interesting. The very first, when I first decided to do anything even remotely resembling Core Decay, my first source of inspiration was actually Wolfenstein: The New Order. I just played that, and it was like, wow, this is actually kind of fun. Like this is actually a really nice game. Like, wow, retro games are kind of but like games with these old school sensibilities are now becoming this thing, which is like it's really cool to see. So I played Wolfenstein: The New Order. I think I also watched one of I think just at that time, Total Biscuit, when he was still alive, he had done a video on specifically the design sensibilities of old school shooters that I found really interesting. So I remember watching that and played Wolfenstein. It's like, okay, I want to do something like this. So that's kind of where that started. And that's only become more and more like bigger and bigger. And we have all of these, like, it's actually really carving out a space for itself now, right? But we haven't seen it as much with these sort of more like slower paced, exploration focused, less arcadey kind of games until now. I mean, obviously we can look at like Arcane Studios games. We can look at Dishonored and Prey, the new Prey game. And we can look at obviously the new Deus Ex games, which are fantastic. But they're also all kind of AAA. They're their own thing. They're fantastic. I mean, I love all of those games. I've played a huge amount of these games. But they don't quite occupy the same space as something that tries to be more like directly inspired by both the aesthetics and the design philosophies of the Deus Ex 1, System Shock, Thief, and so on. So there is a space for that, and I'm really happy to see that even beyond Core Decay, this is really starting to emerge as a sort of a revival of this entire genre.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I talked to Dave Oshry about this a good bit, but how we had this kind of resurgence of what people are calling retro FPS, boomer shooters, whatever. And it's amazing to me that the obvious cycle, like it is happening as we speak, but you start with your Dooms and your Quakes and your Unreals, and then suddenly you start to get your Thieves and your Deus Exes and your
history repeats itself.
Yeah, it's literally just happening all over again. But now it's happening with far better technology, and it's attainable for a solo developer to make a really cool game, right? Or for
and that's
when you start to get.
I mean, that's another thing too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like the ability for a indie dev to make something on their own today is like we've never seen anything like it. We look at, like, say, the Unity engine, which incidentally is what Core Decay is built in. And I mean, Unity is not perfect. It has its share of flaws, but you can't get around that. It's made it really easy for a ton of people to just, throw a game together. Like really the limit, the obstacle of technology is like lower than ever before, which is great. You see so many people, even though they're not necessarily ever going to make finished games, but the fact that you can just stumble into it and just without even thinking, just have an outlet for that. It's fantastic. So I think it's really nice to see.
So I feel like we kind of wrapped that part of the conversation up. I'm curious about you as an individual, like what set you on the path to be a game developer in this day and age? As I said before, Who hurt you?
So to this date, I never owned any game consoles, anything like that. Like that was never part of growing up. I did have a lot of computers. Like that was always like I always, like, growing up, I was a very computer oriented person. The quintessential computer geek, really. And so games in general were always really engaging to me. As I said, like the original Descent was something that I played a lot and really enjoyed. And then I started moving to games like I particularly recall the original Age of Empires. That was like one of the defining games of my childhood. Again, I'm just about 28 now, so I was, it was sort of right at the time where, I was growing up right around the time where these kind of games were coming out. And actually, Age of Empires 1 was probably the first entry into what would become the game development for me, because Age of Empires 1 comes with a map editor. Extremely rudimentary such, but, that was at a young age. I think, I'm pretty sure I wasn't a teenager at the time. I was very young, and that was like the first time I realized that I could like take a game and through that have like a creative outlet for something. So I spent a lot of time in like the Age of Empires 1 map editor, moving on to, of course, the Age of Empires 2 map editor and the Age of Mythology map editor, and later on the Warcraft 3 map editor. So RTS games were actually the first outlet for what would sort of become pure game development when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time just creating all of these custom maps for these, like the HF series and Warcraft 3. And I quickly found like that was something I really enjoyed doing. And alongside that, I found myself also always really interested in programming. There was this sort of an inherent appeal to that, and I didn't really care for it in relation to games more so than anything else in particular. But those kind of things just kind of naturally converged. Like I really enjoyed sort of the aesthetic and sort of almost like narrative appeal of making custom maps for RTS games, and I also really enjoyed coding. And I think like over time it just became kind of obvious to me, like, okay, well that's game development. So that's what I started wanting to do. And if you're not familiar, Warcraft 3 actually, its map editor has a custom programming language. Like it's super extensive. So that also made it like it gave me a really sort of gradual introduction to everything game development. So it sort of started from there. And I think that's the case for a ton of people, right? Like you start with what essentially is modding. At the end of the day, that's really what it is, and it sort of moves on to making games. My first actual, like something sort of resembling a game, Again, I used to have a bunch of Pocket PC, Windows Mobile PDAs back in the day, and there was a Hungarian fantasy game. Like, it was basically an old Blobber, like a Ultima style. I was in touch with the developers for that, and I actually ended up making from scratch some like expansion kits for that, expansion packs for those games. Super obscure. Like, I don't think it's like the most out there, like totally not heard of kind of thing you can imagine. But so it's like it's even hard to talk about because no one really knows that particular. It was not well known. But that's sort of the first like proper game product that I worked on. And honestly, from there it just sort of escalated. I'm originally from Sweden. I moved to the US about almost 6 years ago now. But I've lived in Sweden all my life. And there are a lot of good like universities and institutions there for game development. Like, it was pretty easy for me to get into that right away, like out of high school. I sort of started like in total it would be 5 years of like academic like pursuits related to game development.
Right.
It's it's obvious, like when it comes to like educational systems, it's kind of hard to translate from one country to another, but in general, I basically studied game development, in particular the last 2 years, like more specifically game art mostly, but I really kind of tried to get a broad sort of sense of all aspects of that. And straight out of school, then out of university, I basically got employed pretty much right away here in the States. And I'm currently working. I'm currently working under Damon Sly. I don't know if you know him or not. He is an old industry veteran. Like really. He was behind games like Red Baron, or Mech Warrior, or Earth Siege. Sorry. What am I thinking? Tribes. I'm thinking of Tribes. So he was one of the co-founders of Dynamics back in the day. So
Fox.
it's been really amazing to work with him for the last now 6 years.
Yeah.
Because he has so much industry experience, and I've been doing that ever since, and it's been a lot of fun. But yeah, I really think what it comes down to is that, like, even from like my childhood, I was just really sort of just innately interested in everything game development. Like, I also remember doing things like, I would assemble and create my own board games and just kind of force my peers to play them. They weren't necessarily very good, but I think that just sort of early on showed that drive to do that kind of thing. And honestly, I think that my the reason that I really like game development in particular is that it just has so many pieces that all come together in a way that's like really satisfying and rewarding to me. Like, you look at like the technical joy of coding, and you look at art and like any kind of aesthetics. You look at writing and all of these like narrative appeals, music composing, sound design, just overall like mechanic design and then like actual game design, and you have all of those components and they all come together to like create a greater whole. And I just it really speaks to me, which is also why I've really, especially during development of Core Decay even more so, never tried as hard as I can to be as much of a generalist as I can. Like becoming at least somewhat proficient in coding and composing music and making game art and designing mechanics and all those kind of things. I mean, even now, I literally just spent the last 2 days like just doing writing, like narratively for Core Decay, and it's like, I'm not a professional writer, but getting to engage in that and within the context of something that I love, otherwise it's just really rewarding. But anyway, the bottom line is I think I actually followed a pretty traditional route towards game development. In terms of, really getting interested in game modding and sort of that kind of thing, and then just sort of taking it from there and spinning off that. It's really not that different from a lot of other people, I think.
Well, at this point, man, you're standing on the shoulders of giants and working with some of the absolute best in the business. Period. Like, I just looking at Damon Sly, he made A10 Tank Killer. That's like an old DOS game.
Yep.
But I live
Yep.
in Tucson, right? And so there's an Air Force base here, and they are like the hub for A10s. So I see those planes flying all the time. If you go back and play Postal 2, there's a part where you go to the military base, and they're also here in Tucson, and there's A10s all over the place. So it's like that's the symbol of fucking freedom, baby. Like super.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, no, Damon's fantastic. It's I really love working with him and taking part of all he has. It's a lot of experience.
But
He's
you've
really
gone
good at what he
from,
does.
in the course of 3 years, you've gone from, this game that is just an abstract idea of like, I just want to make a game and it'll be a solo project and maybe I'll do something ambitious with it.
Yeah.
To being published under the same brand as some of the greatest games ever, like Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem. The list goes on and on.
Yeah,
forever.
honestly, like the entire 3D Realms collaboration was, of course, incredibly astounding to me that managed to happen.
When I invited
I did
you
not
to be
expect
part of this
that.
Realms Deep thing, that I'd never imagined that it was going to result in several people getting jobs.
Right? No, I know it's fantastic, and especially since I personally I'm still only working on Core Decay in my free time, right? Like I still have a full-time job, and so and that's not likely to change at any time in the near future. So that's also it's so nice to be able to work with 3D Realms and Slipgate and really sort of make sure that there is a team of people who are able to move this forward when I have maybe a lot less time personally, so that what I can do is more about overseeing the direction of the game and making sure that it becomes what I envisioned, which is great because I think honestly, if that hadn't happened, we probably would have looked at another 5 years or so of development. Because there's only so much you can do in your spare time, and you got a full-time job. I'm married. I have so many just everyday things you want to do all the time. So how much time do you have left for hobbyist game development? It varies, right? And so it's super, super nice to really be able to have that larger team of fantastic people just helping out and being a part of bringing all of this to life. I'm super happy about that.
No, it's same thing for In the Keep. I also have a full-time job. My wife just walked in here with my cat. I've got friends and shit I have to take care of, and the scope of what In the Keep has become. Originally, it was just I'm just gonna publish a podcast once a week, and then it just got so much bigger and more than I could possibly manage. So I think we're nothing without our communities and our friends and the people we work with.
No, for sure.
That's all I really have for you, man. We've been on there for an hour and 20 minutes. You want any closing thoughts? You have an idea of when the game might be released, or just anything?
It's probably too early to give any sort of public estimation, just because things can always change, and I don't want to give people false hopes or expectations or anything like that. For the time being, I really just want to take that sort of Valve-esque mindset of saying, well, it's ready when it's ready, but know that we do have internally a very clear sense of the process. So we're not it's not the kind of development where it's we're just going to slowly whittle away on it and it'll be ready someday. No, we have a very clear sense of when we want to get it done, but I don't want to go out and say share those exact estimations at this point, because things might always change, and it'll probably be some time before. I mean, I can certainly say that the Graven demo came out a few weeks ago, And immediately there were a lot of people who asked me, okay, are we going to see a Core Decay demo soon? No. That I can say. There's not going to be something like that for a while. I think all I really can say and want to say at this point is there will obviously be a lot more to find out at the next round steep.
So,
I
had one, actually, you brought up another point that I just wanted to ask you your opinion on, since you have experience with this. What is the point of the limited time demo? It's out for a week, and if you miss it, you miss it. Like, I feel like that deters people from getting their hands on it. I don't know. I don't know what the idea is behind that.
Yeah, I will say that, like, I agree with that viewpoint. I think personally, I don't really I don't know exactly what everyone's individual motivations are. Obviously, I mean, in my experience, that's been something that's usually it's usually been more of like a psychological promotional kind of thing, where obviously it's kind of by only giving you like a limited access to it over a limited time, it gets you like the thought process, of course, it gets you more excited about it. But I'm sort of with you there, that I don't really personally see I think the downsides are greater than any potential benefit there. That really it does indeed make more sense to just say, well, here's a demo and it's going to be available forever, or at least until we have something else that's a successor to it. I obviously I can't speak for Graven specifically. I have no involvement in Graven's development process, and I have no idea what their reasoning and justifications and ideas are around that. That's not my place to say. I will say, though, that if it was up to me for like if we were releasing a similar kind of thing for Core Decay, my personal inclination would be to not have it be time limited. But that is knowing what I know today, and there might obviously be reasons around that I can't comprehend.
Yeah, I mean, my immediate reaction is like, that's insanity. Why would you do that? But I assume generally like, okay, well, Fred's got to be smarter than me. So
yeah, it's not. I don't feel qualified to say at the end of the day. Essentially, it's just not. But yeah, I'm on the surface level at least. I'm with you there, that I don't really either see the exact thinking there. But I have to assume that there is a good reason, and I'm not going to speak for anyone else.
All right, man. Well, it's been a real pleasure getting to know you for a little while, and I think we should do it again. We can meet up when the demo comes out, Realms Deep maybe next year. Anytime you want, you're always welcome back on the show. Even if you just want to talk about Deus Ex for another hour and a half, that's fine.
Super happy to hear it. Oh, believe me, I could. Really happy to be here. It's been great just talking about the game and game development in general. And yeah, I'm happy to come on at any time.
Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.
All right, thank you very much to Ivar for making an appearance on the show. Finally, it's been a long time coming, and I deeply appreciate the time we spent together. I can't tell you how fucking amazing just being in the presence of such a brilliant mind is. There's a lot of them that come on the show, but Ivar in particular is just one of those guys that stands out. It's like he's a fire hydrant of creativity that just needs to be focused on one area, and I know that he can do it now that he has the backing of 3D Realms. Thank you to Fred, obviously, as always, for being amazing and putting his money and hard work and everything into these incredible games. Everyone at 3D Realms, not just him. But wow. Thank you to Amorpher for providing this awesome, epic, deep, dark music that we're listening to right now. You can find more about him on his Bandcamp page, which of course I will leave in the episode notes for you to peruse his amazing catalog. If you are looking for someone to do dark ambient music for a soundtrack, there is no one better than Amorpher. We got to say thank you to all of our wonderful supporters, and there is a new one for the new year. How amazing is that? Paul, Moose, Dot, Zach, Alexander, Brad, Red Eyes, Anthony, Robert, Jack, Brandy, Fred, Lord Revan, and Zan. The Zan. Yeah, that Zan. I am humbled. The Drowned God Cathala loves all of you. It is absolutely amazing that I do this silly little podcast and it means enough to these people who I've named that their hard-earned dollar, they see it worth their time to put it towards this project. And I assure you, I can't say everything right now, but I assure you it is going to a good place. And I hope that you're all very satisfied with where you end up seeing it. For those out there who are listening and like, how can I support In The Keep? Go to inthekeep.com/support. There's all kinds of ways to do it. We have affiliate links. I'm not going to name them all off today because who cares? Except to you, perhaps, maybe, huh? Check them out. Amazon is on there. There's a couple other ones. Check them out. Doesn't matter. But you can also just go to our merch store, buy a t-shirt. We get the brand new logo, the brand new Sigil of Cathala, designed by the great and awesome Uncle Had. It is beautiful. It is on all of our merch now. You can buy it right now. Do that. If you become a Patreon supporter, you will get all of our content early. All of In The Keep's content early. I can't promise you'll get the new Burning with Bridges with Bridge Burner or whatever early, but you will in fact get In The Keep as early as I can possibly provide it to you when I'm done editing it. Great things on the horizon though, man. 2020 was a shit year for a lot of people. It was a good year for In The Keep. I won't hide that. We did really, really well for ourselves, and I hope that you find a way, if you're in a difficult situation, or just follow your passion and find a way to make your dreams come true. I really hope you do. And I hope that by listening to this podcast, you find the motivation you need. But, it's time to say goodbye. I'll see you again next week. I can't express how much it means to me to spend the time that I do, my free time, producing this piece of content, whatever it happens to be, whatever week you're listening to. I mean, obviously, if you're listening to me talking right now, it's this week, but I mean, anything. Go back through the catalog, check it all out. This is my life's work, and I'm very proud of it. And I hope that you find something you're proud of too. I love you. The Drowned God Cathala loves you. Till next time, stay in the keep.